In our last episode, we discussed 8 areas in which B2B customer experience is different from B2C. So how have those differences influenced the B2B space?
It's more about execution, and companies that execute better and have a better strategy are going to outperform those that don't, and it doesn't seem to matter that much whether it's B2B or B2C.
Exploring the ways B2C has influenced B2B CX, and if B2B is falling behind in making the case for customer experience. On this episode of the CX Leader Podcast.
The CX Leader Podcast with Steve Walker is produced by Walker, a business consulting firm that helps our clients unlock the potential of their customer experiences by placing the customer at the heart of all their business decisions. You can find out more at walkerinfo.com.
Hello, everyone. I'm Steve Walker, Chairman and CEO of Walker Information, also host of the CX Leader Podcast, and thank you for listening. Here on the CX Leader Podcast, we explore the topics and themes to help leaders like you leverage all of the benefits of your customer experience and help your customers and prospects want to do more business with you. In our last episode, we highlighted 8 different areas that B2B customer experience is different from B2C, and the importance of understanding why those differences are critical to your business. So let's expand on that a bit more today. Let's explore how B2C has influenced the B2B CX space and the progress of B2B companies recognizing the advantages of customer experience as a solid differentiator. And to help us guide us through the topic, I'm delighted to welcome back one of our CX luminaries. Bob Thompson is the CEO of CustomerThink Corporation, an independent research and publishing firm focused on customer-centric business management, and he's also the founder and editor-in-chief of CustomerThink.com. Bob, welcome back to the CX Leader Podcast.
Thank you, Steve. Great to be with you.
Well, it's always a pleasure to have you. And to our listeners, if you enjoy this episode, I hope you'll go back and look at our Luminary series, because I think you took our listeners the last time you were on a show on a great kind of retrospective of how the CX industry evolved. And you're obviously a guy that has a lot of perspective on that. And I just really enjoyed having you on the show that time. I'm looking forward to having you on this time. All right. I'm going to put out a couple of assertions here, Bob, and you can either agree with me or straighten me out or somewhere in between. I think we start this podcast from the perspective that B2B is different, number one, and number two, that B2B has historically lagged behind B2C, although I think there's differing opinions about whether that is still the case today. So with those assertions, Bob, what say you?
Well, I mean, there's some clear and obvious differences about dealing with B2B companies. You're dealing with multiple parties. These can be complex relationships, which makes gathering insight more complicated. It has implications for what tools and techniques you use. One relationship can be worth, millions of dollars a year. So it's the impact of key accounts and so on is hugely different than if you're dealing with one consumer, even a consumer that can say bad things about you on social media. So I think those are fairly obvious and straightforward. To get to your question about whether B2B and B2C are which is leading the other, I definitely had the perception a few years ago that B2C was ahead. As I've talked to B2B experts and done a number of studies over the year, I've changed my opinion a bit. I think that some of that was a perception because it's taken a little bit more time for B2B companies to start to use CX terminology. So if you look at what they're actually doing versus what they're calling it, there were programs back, 5 years ago or more that were clearly CX programs, but they were called something else. More and more companies are kind of rallying around customer experience management as the term. And so I think that has led to perception that they're catching up or more of them are adopting CX, but it's not necessarily true that things have changed, just the terminology has changed. That said, I also found that a few years ago that the success rates for B2C companies were a bit higher. But that is not true anymore. In my latest study conducted late last year, the success rates are very much the same. And the and the big picture, the reasons behind more successful companies are also about the same. There are some differences we can talk about, but basically, I think that they're more on a common ground now. And I really don't find a lot of support for the notion that one is ahead of the other.
Well, that's great information for our listeners. What do you think closed the gap, in your opinion?
Well, I think some of it has to do, as I said, with the terminology and sort of taking programs that might have been called something else and bringing them together under more of the umbrella of customer experience management. But there's definitely been some influence, and I know you've talked about this in other programs, but this notion that B2C has influenced B2B is definitely something we're picking up. For example, when we asked a question in our survey, this was a write-in answer, so we didn't give anybody a selection list. We said, what companies do you believe exemplify, quote, great customer experience? The two leading examples were Amazon and Apple. They combined for 30% of all of the responses. And almost all of the examples were B2C companies. I don't think there's any question that there's been a lot of influence on B2B thinking that they should be more consumer-like experiences. And that's been a very positive thing.
Let's talk a little bit about the differences in the approach to understanding the customer experience, B2B versus B2C. What are some of the differences, for example, in terms of how you'd want to go after trying to understand the customer experience more?
Well, there's a couple of, I think, key areas we could talk about. One is the use of metrics. And we found basically no differences in the use of metrics for B2B or B2C. Their Net Promoter Score and customer sat are the two leading metrics used. And Net Promoter Score having a little bit of an edge there, but they're the two big players. Customer effort score, I was a bit surprised with all the focus on reducing effort in recent, especially the last couple of years. It is not as widely adopted as I expected, but it's still a significant metric for some companies. And then custom metrics. But there really wasn't a difference between B2B and B2C in the kind of the mix of metrics that were used. On average, companies use three different metrics. They're not banking everything on Net Promoter Score or anything else. So that picture's the same. I think where the differences are is where do you get the data and how do you get it? And I'll just start by saying that if you're collecting data programmatically, like through automated means, then in B2B you're more likely to use things like text within companies, emails and things like that than you are in B2C. And B2C is more likely to use social media. So there's some sort of, I think, obvious differences in where you get information based on the channels that your customers are using. But in the end, you still have to have the right tools to process that insight and turn it into some kind of action.
Yeah, it's interesting, Bob. Just back to your early assertion that one of the big differences is that one relationship could be worth a substantial amount of money. So really the way you go collect the data is probably segmented or stratified relative to the intensity or the importance of a relationship.
Yeah, I think that's right. And also I would say that, based on my experience in working with large accounts, I did for 15 years when I was at IBM, is that there's nothing that's better than a face-to-face, one-on-one conversation with a key customer.
Yep.
So I think that there's a lot of interest in, creating automated programs and collecting metrics and so on. But, for key relationships, it is a relationship, and sometimes it's personal. And companies that try to automate the things that should be done face-to-face, I think, are making a mistake.
Are you one of the 10,000 people planning to attend the Qualtrics XForce Summit in Salt Lake City? If so, you'll want to catch Steve Walker's breakout session, which focuses specifically on B2B customer experience. He'll dialogue with CX leaders from several companies and focus on how B2B CX is different and what CX leaders should be doing to develop best-in-class strategies. The event will be held March 6th and 7th. If you're planning to be there, be sure to check it out.
My guest on the podcast this week is Bob Thompson. He's the CEO of CustomerThink Corporation and also the founder and editor-in-chief of CustomerThink.com. Bob is engaging us in a conversation about the differences between B2B and B2C CX and whether the perceived gap that we've proposed exists is actually happening still as we speak today. Bob, I think you make an interesting point. In some ways, in a B2B environment, you can actually do much more with the data than you can in a B2C because of the depth of the relationship and the complexity of the relationship. Where are you seeing the successful companies emphasize in using CX management to improve the business in terms of either the business units or the functional level, or how do you see companies deploying that CX management inside the company?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think one of the key issues that more CX leaders and the executives in companies need to think about is what is the overall strategy? Are we just trying to make customer service better, or are we trying to improve the journey, from pre-customer to sales to market, the whole thing, or are we trying to create something that's different? And what we definitely have found in our latest study is that companies that just focus on making existing functional touch points better don't perform as well as those that tackle the bigger problems, the end-to-end journey, or creating something that's more unique. So I think this question of your strategy is hugely important, and I think one of the dangers that companies face is that when you embark on a CX program or initiative, you start looking for problems, and there's usually lots of them around. So, customer service is the most common starting point. But if your vision is just to make customer service better, you're leaving a lot of value on the table. So I think that's a pain point. That's true in B2C as well, by the way. So it's not unique to business to business. There needs to be more thought given to the right strategy up front.
Yeah, and really in B2B, you could start with the customer service, but you could get into improving the product based on customer input. You could enhance your account management. You can look at the channel. I mean, a lot of B2B companies have indirect distribution systems. In some ways, there's a lot more to do on the B2B side once you start to embrace the CX management.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, that's what I've found in the more mature, advanced companies is that they, most companies do start in customer service, but to me, it's kind of like the canary in the coal mine. It's going to give you an indicator that there's problems. Some of these problems are elsewhere. It might tell you that your problems are with your product, and the product is, for business to business, is still a very important source of value. So, fixing the product or making it better, which is to me a much better strategy than just fixing what you got, may be one of the objectives of your program. You might learn about that by incidents in customer service. And you're right, you can extend all of this to your supply chain and other partners, and it can be quite complicated.
What about your perspective on the way B2B companies resource the effort relative to B2C? Again, my perception kind of coming into this dialogue is that it's underweighted in B2B relative to B2C, but maybe you see that differently.
What I can talk about is how the CX leaders perceive it. I'm not sure how to answer it objectively as to whether it's underweighted or not, but I can tell you that there is a very distinct difference. We asked a question about, do you think you need more resources devoted to your CX initiative? And that the resources could be throughout the company, money, people, technology, whatever. So it's a wide range, it's a very broad topic, and 50% of those in B2B companies said yes. In B2C, it was only 22%. So there's a pretty dramatic difference in terms of sort of the intensity of, yes, I need more help. There wasn't as big a difference in terms of where or what kind of help or what kind of skills are needed. But I'd say the big picture is B2B seems to be less satisfied with the resourcing for their programs.
Okay, well, that certainly would be, I think, one indicator. Because to me, and you know that when we were preparing for this show, I was really coming at this from the fact that B2B is behind, and you're winning me over that maybe we're being a little too tough on B2B. But to me, it just feels like B2B is a little bit behind, and maybe that's not the case, and maybe the gap has closed.
In this latest study, we had over 200 CX leaders, lots of companies in B2B and B2C and mixed, by the way, which is another segment. There, a lot of companies are doing both.
Yeah.
You know, there are differences for sure that some of them are kind of obvious and logical, but mainly what I found is that there's more similarities than differences, and that the big findings were basically there's more work needed on strategy to be more visionary in most cases, and less tactical and just solving problems. And secondly, is that there maturity of certain practices. We found 5 that were differences between those who are more successful than the rest. And none of them are a surprise. Things like voice of customer programs, journey mapping, creating a business case, executive support, things like that. So it's not like we found some magic pill or some secret sauce that said, here's the one thing that really is going to, it's more about execution, and companies that execute better and have a better strategy are going to outperform those that don't. And it doesn't seem to matter that much whether it's B2B or B2C.
Well, that leads me into my favorite part of my program, and that is the take-home value. If you're a B2B CX leader out there and perhaps you're wanting more attention for your program, be it resources or recognition or executive support or what have you, what's your quick take on what they ought to be doing right now to improve the perception of their program inside their company?
Well, I think it goes back to sales 101 to be blunt about it. And I've made this suggestion many times, is that, you know, for CX leaders who are maybe feeling a little shaky on their sales skills, is go make friends with a top-notch B2B sales professional, because what you're talking about is selling. And what do great salespeople do? They go to the people they need support from, those are going to make the purchase decisions, and they do fact finding. They find out what the key problems are. They don't start in with a pitch to say, here's the product I have, and here's why it's got these bells and whistles, and why it's got a great price, and here's why you should buy it. Especially not in B2B. They start with customer issues. And I think CX leaders need that skill. And I got this advice from several of the more successful ones. They said, look, you should spend especially in the early days, go out and spend a lot of time with your stakeholders. Go to somebody in marketing, for example, and instead of telling them how great CX is going to be and how you're going to increase NPS and it's going to link to revenue someday, start with questions about their job. What are they trying to get done? Maybe their problem is they would like to get more case studies about customer advocates. Well, it turns out customer experience programs can help with that. So instead of these grand and glorious, connect a point of NPS to X amount of revenue sorts of techniques that I've seen, create a program that delivers value to that marketing manager or to a sales manager or to the contact center manager. And they're going to be 3 different forms of value. And then build a strategy for your CX program around delivering value to those stakeholders and quantify it. And when you take that case up to the executives and say, here's the money I need, and these are three different organizations that are going to get value, and here's where it is, they're going to say yes. So that's my advice.
That's great advice. Sales 101 from Bob Thompson for the CX professional. No, I really like it, and it's a great example of how, you know, you can start talking about NPS and all that, and all the sales guy wants is some more referenceable case studies or, clients he can call on to reference for other prospects. So great advice. Hey, Bob, anything else that we should cover on this topic of B2B and B2C? Anything that you want to make sure our listeners heard that we didn't get out in our discussion?
I think the last thing I'd mention, this is one of the 5 practices that came out, is that to make sure that the program objectives, the CX objectives, are linked to and supporting the vision of the brand. These programs don't exist in a vacuum. And the more successful companies are able to create and support and justify these programs because they support brand values. If you're looking at things more tactically, it might lead you to make investments that aren't good strategically. So if the company has kind of a muddled or unknown brand vision or brand value, then it might be time. I actually ran into a couple of examples here where they stopped and they said, let's figure that out first. Then we know if we're doing a CX initiative, we're focusing on the right things.
My guest today on the podcast has been Bob Thompson, who's the CEO of CustomerThink Corporation and also the founder and editor-in-chief of CustomerThink.com. Bob, thanks again for being a guest on the podcast. I know folks can find you at CustomerThink.com, but you want to give just a little bit more contact information in case anybody wants to follow up with you?
Well, you definitely find me there. You can also find me on Twitter at Bob_Thompson. And you can also write to me via email, Bob@CustomerThink.com. I still use that channel too.
Thanks again. And if you want to talk about anything else we discussed or about how Walker can help your business customer experience, you can contact me at steve.walker@walkerinformation.com or call me here in the U.S. at 1-317-843-8890. Don't hesitate to reach out. I'd love to talk to you more. And if you're planning on being at the Qualtrics XForce Summit in March, be sure to stop by and see us at the Walker booth. We're also planning a pre-event CX tailgate party, and I'll be speaking at a breakout session, so you won't want to miss any of those. You can find a link to more information on our podcast page. Don't forget to subscribe to the CX Leader podcast and tell all your friends and neighbors about it. You can go to the walkerinfo.com/podcasts, and you'll find links to iTunes, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Google Play, and also on our YouTube channel as well. Simply go to walkerinfo.tv to listen. Thank you for listening to the CX Leader podcast, which is a production of Walker. We're a business consulting firm that can help you make customer experience your biggest competitive advantage. Find out more at walkerinfo.com. Thanks for tuning in to this episode, and we'll see you next time.